name of my lecture today is Expelling the Devil from Within, Afro-Caribbean Spirituality and Revolution in the Poetry of Plácido. And as I said before, it is based on Cuban literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, published in 2019 by the University Press of Mississippi. One thing that may be interesting, perhaps when we get to the Q&A section, is to talk about the process of developing your dissertation into a book. Something that I think, is very helpful to have some pointers on that as you move in that direction. In the shadow of the Haitian Revolution, enslaved Africans and their free descendants organized insurrections designed to abolish slavery, depose the Spanish government, and boldly declare Cuban independence. The colonial state characterized the uprisings as, quote, the conspiracy devised by the people of color to exterminate the white population of this island, end quote. The government portrayed freedmen as the indoctrinators of African rebels, and they indicted Plácido el Poeta as a chief conspirator who had devised poetry to conjure up a conspiracy against the queen. Plácido was the most prolific poet in 19th century Cuba, and he maintained covert connections with Black co-conspirators that traversed Havana, Kingston, and New Orleans. Plácido administered loyalty oaths. He spoke with African captives on plantations, and he composed anti-slavery poetry. My lecture analyzes Plácido's portrayal of carnival in the poem El Diablito, which translates the little devil, as subversion of the Catholic symbolic order and a political staging ground for anti-slavery revolution. My analysis privileges the African masquerader derisively referred to in colonial Cuba as the little devil. I revise theories of autoethnography and literary transculturation from Mary Louise Pratt and Ángel Rama, respectively, to propose the idea of transculturated colonial literature. I argue that Plácido's Diablito was not the maleficent entity known as the devil within the Judeo-Christian worldview, but rather a West African masquerader from the Abaquá Male Initiation Society who had come as an agent of retributive justice. Abaquá, that's A-B-A-Q-U with an accent on the A, Abaquá. But who was the devil to be expelled? Was it the African masquerade whose leaps and feline movements offended Catholic sensibilities? Or was it the Spanish Empire that had sanctioned slavery in the name of God? The Abaquá masquerader was a principal symbol of anti-slavery insurgency and the most lethal arrow in Plácido's quiver, because he transformed Epiphany from an event to honor the Christ child into a day of ancestral retribution. The Spanish government denounced three agents of insurrection: the British government, white Cuban reformers, and most significantly, free mulattoes. The colonial state accused free African descendants known as mulattoes and pardos of seducing submissive Africans to join the conspiracy. The accusation read accordingly. I want to show you the actual text from the sentence from the government verdict. But before doing so, I'm going to very briefly give you some background on Plácido to make sure that we're all on the same page. So Plácido was born in 1809 in Havana, Cuba, was then the capital of Cuba, the second capital of Cuba. The first capital of Cuba was Santiago de Cuba in the east of the island. He was born to a Spanish woman, Concepción Vázquez, and Ferrer Matoso, an African descendant that would have qualified, I believe, as a quadroon or cuarteron, someone thought to have a fourth African ancestry. The Latin American, I'm going to say particularly Spanish American racial hierarchy operated in a system of gradations where white supremacy was still enshrined as the standard, but instead of there being a black-white dichotomy, there was a white, non-white dichotomy, and then several stages that were thought to lead towards a state of whiteness. This was even enshrined in law. We can talk about that later if someone is interested in it. Plasso was abandoned to an orphanage, and he was raised by his Black grandmother. According to the best sources we have from 19th century Cuba, she was thought to be, according to one source, she was a formerly enslaved woman. Plasso began publishing in the year 1834, and he began introducing emancipatory ideas about maybe about 3 or 4 years after that. He became the most prolific poet in 19th century Cuba, producing more literature even than Jose Maria Heredia. Plasso joined the anti-slavery movement of 1844, and he was one of the leaders of that movement. Cuban historiography has argued, debated, I should say, whether or not Plasso was involved at all. Some scholars in Matanzas, where Plasso's primary operations took place, argue he was not involved at all, that he was a hapless victim. But Professor Desique Fernandez, who I worked closely with, who was a great help to me while doing my research in Cuba, demonstrates that he was involved. I argue he was more than a courier and a propagandist, as she says, but not necessarily the leader of the conspiracy. I don't think we have successfully identified the leader of the conspiracy. Plasso was sentenced to death by the colonial state in 1844 as the leader of the movement to exterminate the white population, though the aims of the movement were disputed by Plácido. Let's take a moment to look at the judgment pronounced by the military commission. You have the judgment here on the left. That's either from Harvard or from Havana. I don't remember exactly, but there's two such judgments that I looked at for the book. The accusation read accordingly, quote, "The freedmen penetrated the farms, the country roads, and even the bohíos, slave huts, themselves, disseminating their maleficent ideas. They haven't concerned themselves with anything else for some time now. The seed had penetrated in all directions, and they only needed a sign to set in motion that horrifying sacrifice." The penetration of the African subconscious with revolutionary doctrines was the mulatto's gravest crime. The government narrative about submissive indoctrinated Africans is as ironic as it is ahistorical. Since the advent of the slave era in the Western Hemisphere, white slaveholders have relied upon African knowledge to plant cotton in Mississippi, cultivate rice in South Carolina, and forge metals in the Caribbean. It was African knowledge, not only African labor, that constituted the epistemological foundations of certain wealth-producing industries in the Americas. Moreover, Plácido, the free mulatto accused of being the chief conspirator, relied on African religious knowledge to animate an anti-slavery movement that the Spanish government managed to extinguish in its infancy. In this lecture, I demonstrate how Plasso transformed the African masquerade, which had been the object of laughter, mockery, and folly, into an agent provocateur that conspired to exact revenge on the colonial state. The government named abolitionist David Turnbull and free Haitian Louis Guigaud as proxies that had recruited a conspiratorial junta with illusory promises of freedom. Principal among their recruits was Plácido the poet, or Plasso el Poeta. The government maintained that Plasso had gone from bad to worse, from proselyte to recruiter, from disciple to architect of a genocidal plot to exterminate the white population on the island of Cuba. I posit transculturated colonial literature as a theoretical proposition to examine autoethnographic writings as texts that are situated on the periphery, yet palatable to a metropolitan audience. Transculturated colonial literature adapts Hispano-Catholic symbolism and neoclassical and romantic tropes to make Afro-Latin cultural subjectivity legible. This is what anthropologist Stephen Palme has designated as, quote, a culturally specific mode of knowledge production, end quote. Plasso's rhetorical arsenal was defined by an abiding belief in prophecy. Plasso practiced an insurgent spirituality consisting of three axes: the power of prophecy to pretend Black liberation, the African Cabildo as an organizing principle, and the loyalty oath as a speech act that consecrates the dark body for revolution. Plasso's poem, The Little Devil, introduced the African masquerader through two disparate prisms, one Black and African, and the other white and Catholic. For many white onlookers, Carnival was little more than drunken revelry and superstition, but for Cuban observers with the appropriate cultural literacy, it was a call to action conveyed from the other world. I want to take a moment here to share with you I actually want to come back to this right here so that you have some stanzas from the poem. I'll come back to that other slide. A direct citation from Plasso's poem, The Little Devil, will illustrate my point. Quote, various onlookers, each from his own angle, gaze at the passers-by that emerge onto the road. But as each one, with their eyes fixed and through different prisms, viewed the objects, not one was observed the same by all, and so inequality was a true type. At the same time, everyone mocked the lone traveler because it was easy for many to laugh at an individual, I want you to pay attention to the word onlooker, to think of Carnival, something we're celebrating here in Mobile. We're not too far from Pensacola and especially New Orleans. To pay attention to the fact that the audience of varied peoples, sailors from across the world, had their eyes fixed, but they're all viewing things through different prisms. Plasso made that a point. He says inequality was a true type. I believe that's a pun, where he may be speaking not only about the different ways in which the festival masquerader is being viewed, but also speaking of inequality within Cuban society. And then finally, the notion that the African masquerade is an object of mockery for the uninitiated. The prism was Plasso's chosen metaphor, which symbolized the multiple ways passersby might interpret the African-inspired masquerade on January 6th, Three Kings Day. In the same way that onlookers in the poem misinterpret the masquerade, Catholic spectators distorted the carnivalesque subject, construing him as the devil, a maleficent creature in ecclesiastical dogma. The 1796 Slave Catechism characterized the devil as, quote, one of our enemies, end quote, and the other foes were, quote, evil people in our own bodies, end quote. Catechists taught that the devil was a slave's nemesis, that the slave master was a legitimate representative of papal authority, Africans disagreed. The devil as such did not exist in African cosmologies. In some African cosmologies, evil emanates from several cosmic forces, amounting to what Kola Abimbola has termed, quote, a polydemonic conception of evil, end quote. Contemporary white Cuban descriptions of African-inspired masquerades provide historical evidence of their theological confusion. I believe the next slide will, see if I have it here. Okay. So I'll read from white Cuban professor and novelist Ramon Mesa, a major 19th century Cuban figure. Ramon Mesa was one such passerby who characterized January 6 processions through a lens that differed significantly from Plácido's. Quote, from early dawn, you could hear the monotonous rhythm of those large drums all over the place. The slaves abandoned their homes early in the morning, and the groups of Black slaves left the plantations to come. In the middle of the ring circle, 2 or 3 couples danced, making the most extravagant contortions, leaping and doing turns and steps to the beat of the frantic rhythm of the drums. Agitation and joy broke out in frenzy. At midday, the diversion came to a peak. On Mercaderes, Obispo, and O'Reilly streets, there was an uninterrupted procession of little devils. Sailors from every nation came down the street in one group to see that exotic revelry, end quote. Mesa misconstrues all African-inspired masquerades as an indecipherable monolith of little devils whose peculiar practices are nothing more than an African diversion on Cuban soil. Sailors from around the world misread elaborate costumes, drums, dancing, and acrobatic movements as a bizarre combination of agitation and joy. The unknowing gaze discards the possibility that the festival performance might represent sacred ritual to members of the cabildos involved. Ramon Mesa's color writing portrait of the masquerade implies that exotic revelry is superstition, thus rendering the cultural subject unintelligible to his readers. Very similar to what Plasso said in the poem. He's an onlooker that misunderstands what he sees. Mesa's portrayal is analogous to Father Felix Varela's notion that the superstitious person, or el supersticioso, is beneath reason and worthy of Christian contempt. Varela wrote, quote, "In the nations where the only true religion has been established, which is Catholicism, her divine origin demands there be only one divine modus operandi, and this cannot be found in the vicissitudes, limitations, and whims of human understanding. The principle of authority is fundamental," end quote. But Mesa's reading of the subject was little more than white noise. There are no references to the particulars of costume. There are no references to dance or percussion. As Mary Louise Pratt argued, the colonized other is depicted as a homogenized they, suspended in a timeless present tense with no future and no reputable past. On this same point, David Walker explains that Three Kings Day masqueraders were referred to as diablitos, little devils, indiscriminately. So 19th century writings about January 6th that allude to little devils may refer to any number of African-Cuban masqueraders. In contradistinction to Plácido's other representations of Afro-Caribbean spirituality, in the little devil, the masquerade does not conceal himself behind a Catholic veneer. Rather, his is a mask of a different ilk. The carnival performer represents the Abaquá male initiation society that transformed Epiphany from a celebration of the advent of the Christ child into a day of ancestral vengeance. Abaquá is a Cuban fraternal order with origins in the old Calabar region of Nigeria and Cameroon, where Efik was the pre-colonial lingua franca among many ethnicities. Today, I believe English would be the lingua franca there. Africans speaking the Efik language founded the first lodge outside Havana in Regla in 1836. The Abaquá Fraternal Order of Cuba was reconstructed from several local variants of the Ekpe Leopard Society of the Nigerian Cameroonian Cross River region. Ekpe literally translates as leopard in the Efik language, and in Abaquá cosmology, the leopard symbolizes the virility and agility of African manhood. So I'm going to take us back here to a slide right here. The African-Cuban masquerade is an Abaquá masquerade. Once again, Abaquá is a male initiation society or fraternal order. I like to use maps to help people to locate, to think about the culturally specific origin of knowledge production, in line with what anthropologist Stephen Palmate argued in Wizards and Scientists. So here's modern day Nigeria, modern day Cameroon. Of course, neither of these countries existed as such. You had a series of kingdoms. One thing about the societies that existed in this Cross Rivers region right here is that they did not have the same state formation as you would have found in the Kingdom of the Congo or in Dongo, Benin, or Dahomey, where you had a royal family and different processes of secession. Instead, you had Ivor Miller uses the term city-states, and he says that each of these societies had an Ekpe leopard society that's EKPE, Ekpe leopard society, that governed over it. So those societies were governed by this fraternal order. So you can see how significant, how important it was. I'm going to continue with more stanzas from the poem that will help us to identify this particular African masquerade as Abaquá. The following stanzas from Plasso's poem reveal my point. Quote, nevertheless, there are always unforeseen events. And that day, it happened to be the 6th of January, or so it said. An unforeseen object came to impose the law upon them. It was a little devil dancing in front of his cabildo. All at once, 100 colors on his outfit glimmered or shone. Seen in the checkered pattern, it was the character himself. One of the onlookers, more contemplative than others, look at what the world has become, he said to his companions. It's always the same subject. He who is always present. He dances every year and is always the same little devil, end quote. The Abacoa masquerade was the ideal symbol of anti-slavery insurgency because he gave voice to a political project that fused racial egalitarianism with knowledge of African-inspired spirituality. Carnival represented more than a symbolic inversion of society. It commingled play with ritual, mockery with solemnity, and within its liminal space, there were formidable metaphysical possibilities. The last 5 stanzas specify the date of performance, January 6th. They link the masquerader's spectacle to his cabildo. They describe his costume, and they explain his political function. Although the public misinterprets the dance, the masker parades and pirouettes through the streets of Havana with great provocation and symbolism. He fulfills a specific function. Quote, he has come to impose a law upon them, end quote. In the colonial period, Ireme led processions in front of his cabildo, and he conducted purifications to send away evil forces that inhabited the physical world. Cuban slave society was impregnated with the presence of long departed slaveholders and their earthly captives, as Plasso pointed out in another Cuban fable in verse, La figura de un alma, also which I translate to the silhouette of a soul. The Abacoa masquerade, known as Ireme, performed a cleansing ritual of the social landscape to wash away what Manzano had called cosa mala, which translates to evil forces. That term is still used sometime in Cuba, cosa mala, evil forces, in his autobiography. According to an Abacoa initiate, the Ireme masqueraders were spirit messengers and manifested, materialized, represented spirit. These emissaries from the other world embodied ancestral spirits and mythological characters. Plasso's transculturated poem subverted the master-slave relationship so that the unforeseen object imposed the law of retribution. On the surface, the linguistic construction is contradictory because the object of public scorn acts on behalf of the African Cabildo, or African Brotherhood, as an agent of retribution, unleashing punishment from the other world on an unsuspecting Cuban public. So the public mocks this masquerade as he moves through the streets. They don't necessarily know what to think of him. They associate him perhaps, as Fernando Ortiz says, with the Corpus Christi festival. Anything that looks like a horn, they assume that it's tied to the lower hemisphere, to the satanic, to the infernal. And so what Plasso does is he presents this particular character, this masquerade, as a misunderstood figure, and he questions the public's understanding of it. And then towards the end of the poem, he tells the public precisely what that masquerade has come to do. So we're reading through the obfuscation and the opacity, but we should think of the opacity not only as something that exists because of colonial censorship and because Catholicism is the official language of colonial Cuba, but it exists because those who hold the secrets need to keep them secret for their own political reasons. The checkered pattern on Ireme's costume may also be read as a counter-hegemonic text, because in Cuba, the checkered pattern represented the leper's claws. So the pattern that you see here, this representation, the one I showed before was from Landaluce. I don't remember his first name, but it's from the 1870s.
Victor.
Victor Landaluce, gracias. Victor Landaluce. What's really interesting about this is that some scholars of African-inspired religion in the Western Hemisphere are very careful to not to associate or attribute any representation, any painting of an African-inspired tradition done by an uninitiated person like Victor Landaluce, what I understand he was uninitiated, with the tradition themselves. In other words, people are not certain if there's a fidelity between the image and the tradition itself. But with regard to this particular masquerade, the Abakwa masquerade, cultural historian Ivor Miller, whose work spans Nigeria, Cameroon, and Cuba, who speaks both Efik and speaks Spanish, is able to confirm that the Nigerians do recognize this particular representation as an accurate representation of the masquerade. One of the differences would be the number of bells, and the Ekpe society would think of the pattern, the checkered pattern, not as claws as the Cubans do, but rather as the leopard's spot. But in both cases, both the Cubans and the members of the Ekpe society, the leper society in West Africa, associated with the leopard. And the mission is the same. He has come to impose the law upon them. So in colonial Cuba, the Abakwa Fraternal Order, or Male Initiation Society, was misrepresented, and even demonized. Let me reread that. In colonial Cuba, the Abakwa Fraternal Order, or Male Initiation Society, was misrepresented and even demonized. So Plasso's choice of symbolism was doubly othered, and his poem was extremely subversive. The depiction of the festival masquerader as an agent of retributive justice mirrored the allegations brought against Plasso in the 1844 proceedings. Alleged co-conspirators Lorenzo Caballero, Pascual Hernandez, and Henry Chavez testified that the poet attended a Three Kings Day, or Dia de Reyes celebration, in the Matanzas home of Santiago Alvarez. According to their testimony, Plasso met with other persons of African descent to devise an island-wide conspiracy against the whites after sharing a meal with his host. Congregating on a religious holiday to conspire against the plantation slave economy demonstrates that Plasso and other conspirators deconstructed the political rationale behind Catholic Carnival so that Epiphany came to serve the sacred purposes of an anti-slavery worldview. Moreover, at the Cuban National Archive, I uncovered a little-known government report about the 1844 movement that maintains that Three Kings Day, el Dia de Reyes, held tremendous symbolic importance for Black and mulatto conspirators who had designated said day to commemorate their triumph over Spain at the Morro Fortress in Havana. What is more, African cabildos and matanzas were the organizational nuclei of the 1844 plantation uprisings that Plasso was indicted for having planned. Africans and their descendants sought to abolish slavery, depose the colonial regime, and institute their own government on the island. In that fable written in verse, Plasso resignified the masquerader so that the little devil, a much maligned character, prophesied revenge. The Spanish government at the highest level sought to silence Plasso's genius for subverting the symbols upon which the Queen's authority relied. Plasso understood as much, as his statement to the president of the military commission bears out. These statements are found in the book in chapter 6, return to the sentence, la sentencia contra los conspiradores pardos y mulatos. It was called Sentencia pronunciada por la sección de la Comisión Militar establecida en la ciudad de Matanzas para conocer de la causa de conspiración de la gente de color. The Spanish are nothing if they're not verbose. Okay. In conclusion, Plasso understood as much, as his statement to the president of the military commission bears out, quote, my relationship to Jorge Bernocchi, these are Plasso's words, and Pimienta, and the fatal esteem they have granted my verses, has made some of them firmly believe that I was the ringleader, and others, being certain that isn't the case, find it convenient to say that it is, end quote. There is something instructive about the narrative tension in this passage. When Plasto's apologia virtually devolves into a confession, Plasto inadvertently admitted to a poetics of conspiracy that had enabled him to sow seditious ideas, rouse emotion in his readership, and impart a spiritual paradigm for revolutionary exploits. On June 20th, 1844, Spanish authorities executed Plasto de Matanzas before a firing squad. The military tribunal ordered that Plasto be shot in the back as the chief architect, recruiter, and instigator of, quote, the conspiracy devised by the people of color in the city for the extermination of the white population of the island, end quote. But death was not the ultimate act of silencing. The Queen of Spain forbade her subjects to recite Plasto's poetry, consecrate his memory, or even utter his name. Thank you. Thank you.